Hello, everybody, and welcome to another webinar, Zoom press conference from the Foreign Press Association in New York. And this week, we're continuing some of the themes we've had before on the methods and quality of reporting, and in particular, how to meet obstacles in reporting. And there's no greater obstacle than the Great Wall of China, the interception that the Chinese People's Republic of China puts in against people trying to get information across the cyber wall of China. So there's a lot of effort being gone into this. It's a huge, intensive. Albania and North Korea couldn't do it because they don't have the resources, but the People's Republic do. They really look after this. But there are chinks in that wall, and we have Mara Hvistendahl, who is an investigative reporter with The Intercept, who has a book coming out shortly about the scientist and the spy, which is about the other side of this, is that yes, the Chinese are repressive. Yes, the People's Republic, I should say, is repressive and does attempt to stifle information. But conversely, the FBI and many people in the American establishment are xenophobic, sinophobic is a technical term, I suppose, and equally relentless in their pursuit of all things Chinese. And as often in these cases, we've asked Bill Holstein, former president of the Overseas Press Club, who used to do reporting in China in the old way, wandering around the streets of Beijing with pencil in hand and pencil and notebook in hand and talking to people. Mara will explain to us some of her surprisingly new and sophisticated ways of how to get your notebook and pencil in front of people without actually physically crossing either the Great Wall or the cyber wall. So maybe the best thing to do is to come up with, Mara, tell us about your book, first of all, since no good author allows an occasion like this
Sure.
to go on past.
So my book actually came out last February, but there was a bit of other news that month. It came out the same week that Dr. Li Wenyang deceased in Wuhan, and where people were first starting to become aware of the scope of the pandemic. But it is out in paperback in 2 weeks. And so, I've continued to speak about it. It focuses on the case of a man named Robert Mo, or Mo Hailong, who was found in a cornfield outside Des Moines. And it was a Monsanto cornfield. The corn growing there was protected as a trade secret, and his appearance there sparked a 2-year FBI investigation involving surveillance planes, car chases across corn country, and at one point the use of a FISA warrant. So this is a warrant that is typically reserved for extreme national security threats. So I use this case, which is pretty colorful, at one point involves smuggling or an attempt to smuggle corn seeds back to China in microwave popcorn bags so that they can be reverse engineered there, to show this larger battle between the US and China over industrial espionage and some of the fallout of these cases. The case of Robert Mo is just one of dozens that have been brought over the past few years. Just last week, there was a department chair at MIT charged with grant fraud and that case is kind of being wrapped together with some of the trade secrets theft cases in which the charge is economic espionage. And these are now under something that the Justice Department calls the China Initiative. And so there's just been a concerted effort that started under the Obama administration and intensified under the Trump administration, and now continues to today to go after IP theft from China and to prosecute largely scientists and entrepreneurs for stealing US secrets.
Just to put this in perspective, Wenho Lee, was it when he was prosecuted, it was for nuclear secrets, allegedly. So now the FBI is chasing people for genetically modified popcorn on behalf of Monsanto. It's just,
right. So there has been this shift
out of proportion here.
Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, China is very good at standard espionage and, you know, those sorts of political cases and scandals where, you know, for example, China rolled up the CIA network in broad daylight several years ago. Those sorts of stories continue to emerge, but over the past few years, we've seen this trend toward the FBI and counterintelligence establishment also focusing on the issue of trade secrets theft. And in those cases, there has been this shift toward treating, you know, instead of people stealing, for example, nuclear secrets, we have people who are targeting things like pharmaceuticals or corn or you know, insulation that's used in buildings, and toward arguing that by targeting those materials, they are going after US innovation. The problem with some of these cases, and the problem with the case that I looked at in the book, is that, you know, there is this concerted effort by Chinese companies to steal secrets from US companies. The US government has effectively taken on the legal expenses of very large corporations. And so in many of these industries, they're fundamentally uncompetitive. And you have big corporations like Monsanto, like DuPont.
These are the wonderful people who gave you Roundup. The Chinese.
Right. So they don't have, those companies don't in fact have a lot of allegiance to the US government in the way that a Chinese company might to the Chinese government. So there was this irony where by the time that I'd finished my reporting, Monsanto had been acquired by Bayer and was no longer even a US company.
So let's take it from, apart from the anomaly of the US government pursuing stuff on behalf of multinational corporations, Monsanto is now part of Bayer, which is German, isn't it? So it's, you know, it's nice to know Uncle Sam is looking after the Germans. I'm sure Angela Merkel is really grateful for this. But it's, when it comes to actual reporting from China, well, like we had the COVID, during the COVID epidemic, we had the CDC of Taiwan on one of our conferences here, and they were saying how they were monitoring internet traffic, which is where they first got wind that there was a SARS type virus which was communicable and spreading around Wuhan. And so obviously they had their ways in, which you would expect from the Taiwanese having, you know, a close connection. How do you get in? What do you find? How do you find your way in through the wall, and what do you find? For example, I think you were looking at the Uyghurs and the concentration camps in the.
So Taiwan has done a very good job of managing the pandemic, and I think they should get more attention for managing the situation, keeping cases low to almost non-existent, and yet doing it in a way that is not repressive and that is not trampling on people's civil liberties or, you know, resorting to extreme surveillance. And, you know, in terms of accessing information, you know, we are in a very difficult situation where China has lately kicked many Western journalists out, and other people see the writing on the wall and increasingly feel uncomfortable traveling back to China, even with a valid visa. You know, it used to be for years. Here, I'm so sorry, I just fell over. You know, Chinese, for years,
the Chinese are after
maybe. For years there was you know, the scrutiny and the difficulties primarily fell on our Chinese colleagues, and, you know, for Chinese passport holding reporters were in a very difficult situation. But increasingly we're seeing detentions of foreign passport holders, and, you know, it makes me very nervous as a journalist, having reported on sensitive topics, But there is a lot that can be done outside of China. With this kind of explosion of OSINT research or open source intelligence, there's a lot that can be done with satellite analysis. So many important stories on the internment camps in Xinjiang and on forced labor have been done that way. My colleague Li Fang and I at the Intercept, we did a story on laptops that were made by Lenovo using forced labor. And we got a tip this summer that many shipments of these laptops are bound for the United States, and they appeared to be going to US schools. And this issue of forced labor from Xinjiang is becoming very significant. And it shows how issues of repression and surveillance in China are global. So they are very much tied to the Chinese government, of course, but there are US companies and Western companies who also bear responsibility for what is happening. And we're seeing increased pressure on companies to monitor their supply chains, to make sure that their products, and this is particularly garment companies, but also electronic companies, are not made using forced labor. And that's largely as a result of the work that journalists and activists and human rights organizations have done over the past few years.
Just as symbolic of what you're talking about, Lenovo was formerly known as IBM, wasn't it?
It purchased the IBM's PC division, but it was always a separate company.
That's right, yeah.
So, Mara, are you finding people who are on the inside from China who are beginning to try to tell the story to Western reporters or Western sources? Are people beginning to try to leak databases or leak information so that the world can know what's happening?
There has been a trend toward more leaks and more data-based reporting over the past few years. There have been some very important stories that have been done that way. There's also been, even as there's growing repression in China, there is this kind of flowering of writing by Chinese people about China. And so in some ways we understand better than before what is going on. But on balance, it would of course be better to have more access to the country.
Well,
how do you get access to, sorry, Ian, let me just follow the thread for a moment, Ian. How does one obtain data, Chinese data, and how does one then make any sense out of it?
Well, so I worked for several years as the China Bureau Chief for Science in China. And so my job often involved trying to make sense of data, and it was very fraught. Even things like the census data were often suspect. So, the COVID data, it's fairly clear that China has done a good job of managing the pandemic, but I would imagine that there are issues with that as well. And, you do your best with what you have. I think that trying to, in many ways, it's a great place to learn how to become a reporter, because you're forced to go out and talk to people on the ground, and you can't do kind of lazy stories where you pass on, this is the government's narrative, here's the press release, here's what this person says that is happening, because very often those people won't talk to you. So you kind of have to do this bottom-up reporting for every story, and that is a very good skill to learn as a reporter.
Sorry, Ian, go ahead.
Well, I was just the point about the Chinese is that they are taking tremendous risks. My friend Michael Kovrig has been arrested as a hostage, as a spy, because he's a researcher for the International Crisis Group, and all he was doing was collecting information, which is what a reporter's job is. But
that's a horrible case.
Collecting information is spying, isn't it?
It's a horrible case, right? So, the tragic thing about many of these prosecutions against scientists is, in the US, you have cases where people have committed the crime they're accused of. You also have cases where people have been charged, and then it has turned out several months down the road that that the charges are dropped and that the US government misunderstood the science in the case. And so there is this concern, and the problem is that the US, of course, relies on a foreign-born research force. And in order to continue to be innovative, we have to have a continued flow of people from overseas and make sure that people feel comfortable here. So there is concern among many researchers that they are being unfairly targeted. But then on the same, by the same token, when people go back to China to do research, and often Chinese Americans are the first ones to be suspected by the Chinese government. So there was a geologist named Shui Feng who was in prison for years in China, I believe under state secrets charges. And that the state secrets law is just widely used to imprison people for a whole variety of offenses.
Well, it's almost as bad in the US, doesn't it? Because people, if you look at the charge sheet against Wen Ho Lee and the other cases you came, I mean, no rational person, unless they were imbued with deep xenophobia, would actually have pursued them, because these people are under suspicion for being Chinese as much as being secrets. It's almost as though after Pollard, we went after and arrested Jews for being spies for Israel, ipso facto.
Well, the Wen Ho Lee case is a good example of the government mishandling an investigation. Most people now agree that he did not get a fair shake. And so, it's impossible to speculate about what the outcome would have been otherwise. He did do some things that made investigators suspicious, but that case is widely remembered by scientists. And one important lesson, if we look back, is that in its wake, there were many nuclear researchers who were ethnic Chinese who left the US and went back to China. I mean, so many that they had something called the kind of Los Alamos group. And that is a very dangerous flow of talent. I mean, these people felt like they were not welcome in the US, and it became harder for labs to recruit Asian American scientists. And that is a result that we do not want. Obviously we don't want security risks at national labs, but by the same token, there should not be this feeling that people are being targeted unfairly.
Well, the computer industry, if the Indians if India goes bandit against the United States.
And there's a really very serious government effort, Chinese government effort, to penetrate America's top research institutions, and they often hide behind Chinese Americans and ethnic Chinese. And the great danger in talking about these things is you can be accused of being racist when in fact you're trying to identify clear patterns of massive theft of IP. So it's not a case where this is a witch hunt or a red scare. There's clearly a government orchestrated campaign to strip America of intellectual resources on one of the greatest scales we've seen in history. I wanted to ask Mara about the presence of Chinese students in American universities. About 360,000, 1,000 recently left the country under pressure from the FBI, apparently because they were officers in the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, secretly. It was not disclosed. Can you believe that? And what can be done? I understand the duality of this. We want Chinese students here to help us support our scientific efforts. We want them to feel comfortable, but at the same time, we don't want to be patsies. We don't want to be stupid about it. What can we do about the researchers in our universities?
Well, so I would, just to go back, I would argue that both things can be true, that there is racism within the counterintelligence agencies, and particularly within the FBI. I think the past few weeks, if anything, have underscored that investigators are often overlooking offenses or overlooking threats by people who look like them, and are instead more likely to focus on people who don't look like them. And we know that there is a diversity problem within the FBI. I've talked to Asian American agents who say that they are routinely encounter racism, and that is part of the problem too, that they are being sidelined. To the point where one Asian American agent told me that he was instructed not to date Asian American women. And he said, well, are you saying like essentially I have to date white women? And that is the message that they are being sent. And so that is true. It can also be true that calling out racial profiling is something that the Chinese government then uses at, the Global Times will run with that in a headline. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. I would argue that we should make sure that investigations are airtight, that they are, devoid of racism from the beginning. There are incentives for Chinese companies to steal technology. But there are also many scientists who have been working in China, who have been encouraged to work in China for years. And the nature of our two economies at this point is that they are very intertwined, and that there are people who, for years have been traveling on behalf of their company, and suddenly their relationships with people in their home country are suspect for reasons that may not always hold water. And so these are complicated cases because they involve this intersection of China IP law, which is very complicated, and then complex technologies. So you take on a case involving corn breeding, as I wrote about in my book, and suddenly you need to understand, the difference between inbred seed and hybrid seed. And all of this then coupled with the fact that there is this tendency among investigators to favor people who look like them, means that there are cases where the outcome, is tinged with racism. I did a big investigation for the Intercept last year where, and some of this research was in my book as well, I obtained records using the Freedom of Information Act showing that the FBI had a concerted program to surveil ethnic Chinese students in the United States in the 60s and 70s. And you mentioned the Chinese students, and this was not just people who had ties to the military or who were party members, although many people were at that time, but this was just every ethnic Chinese person who came to the United States to study in the sciences. And that is a level of surveillance that we should not tolerate.
Clearly, there is an element of racism, but take for example, the case of Mr. Xu of the Ministry of State Security, who's attempted to steal secrets about how GE makes carbon fiber for its jet engines in Cincinnati. He was caught in a sting in Justice Department, caught him in a sting in Brussels and brought him here, arrested him and extradited him. He was engaged in clearly a government-directed effort to steal the secrets to how General Electric makes such great jet engines. I mean, that's happening. We shouldn't allow the racism charge to overshadow or completely turn a blind eye to what clearly are government-orchestrated efforts to steal cutting-edge American technology.
Bill, are you suggesting that the United States doesn't have spying operations in China trying to steal their technology?
As Mara just said, the CIA operations there were shut down. I think that we have the NSA networks going in China probably, but our human intelligence on the ground in China is very limited. So no, I do not think we're stealing technology from China on nearly the same scale that they're stealing it from us.
So, I do think they got it going again, but I agree with you that it appears that the siphoning of technology is on a different scale.
Yeah.
And partly because we're at a different stage in development and don't and have the same need. US corporations steal from each other all the time. But I think that there's this fundamental issue of, there is a problem, there's a legitimate problem, much like there was an issue after 9/11 where there was a need to go after terrorism. But how do we go after terrorism, and how do we do it in a way that is productive, and that, where we don't cast too wide of a net and end up with deleterious effects that could hurt us down the road. And I think that is the situation that we're in now, where you have many people who feel that there are enough cases. There are cases like the one you mentioned, where I believe that involved somebody from, that involved an MSS agent, or a Jiangsu province level intelligence agent, right? So there are cases like that where there's a very clear government connection. There are also cases where, like that of Xiao Xingxi, who was a department chair at Temple University, in physics department, or he was interim chair. The FBI knocked on his door one morning with a battering ram, and he was charged with wire fraud connected to suspected transferring technology to China, and that case fell apart very rapidly within a few months. And there are other cases like that on a level that we should not be seeing, right? So normally when prosecutors get ready to charge somebody, they should have an airtight case. They don't want these cases falling apart down the road.
I think the FBI is probably the wrong agency. I don't believe they've ever found a terrorism case that they didn't start with paid informants, that they missed all of the real ones as a fairly consistent pattern. But have you had, what interference have you had from the government from Beijing in your reporting in any way? Have you had interference? Have you had threats? Have you had communications? Have you had bribes? I mean, offers of bribes, I should say.
Yes, I think one of the weird things about reporting in China is that you can never predict how a story is going to play. And now it may be just across the board that you can assume that certain stories were sensitive, but I was there for long enough that there were periods where I was assigned to go report supposedly positive stories. For example, on a town that was kind of going all solar and installing solar panels on the roof. And I have never been more surveilled than on that one trip, I think because they had not turned on the solar panels. And I still don't know exactly what was going on. And I had the same experience trying to report on panda breeding. But there are also stories. There are also stories where you go in and you look at something very sensitive, like the one-child policy. I've been to coal mines. I've been to all kinds of places, and you end up getting people to talk to you and hearing what seems to be the real story. And so I always found it hard to predict which it would be.
Well, in the Chinese Communist Party, of course, the default is shut up, isn't it? It's not a transparency. Whereas in other countries, there might be a default of, oh, tell them what they want, be open. In the Chinese Communist Party,
yeah, and I mean, similar.
Whatever you tell them is likely to be used in evidence against you. Right,
probably. Yeah, and I think that it ultimately does backfire, right? Because journalists hate to be told a kind of false story and treated that way, and so you end up with people suspicious when they don't need to be, right? So the way that, for example, the Chinese government has been behaving around the issue of COVID origins is by lately pushing its own conspiracy theories. Like lately, for example, this week that the virus started in the US at Fort Detrick, that just makes people more suspicious, right? That there is something hidden there.
Well, Mara, having lived in China as long as you did, what do you think they're doing with the massive amounts of data that they're stealing from the Office of Personnel Management, from Marriott, from Equifax. Recently, at APT-10, they cracked the IBM cloud computing network and ran off with 100,000 names of US members of the US Navy and their identifications. I mean, just massive amounts of data are being stolen. What do you think they're doing with that?
Well, so that's an issue where I would imagine that the United States is doing the same to China, right? So when the OPM hack happened, James Clapper said, basically we would do the same. It's horrible what happened, but we would do the same. And, I did a story on a State Department espionage case where the charge was an espionage, but it was in that ilk where somebody in the State Department was suspected of leaking information to China. And the US investigators in that case were able to tap a mobile phone call in China. And, one source told to me that, it seems like they have somehow access to the mobile network in China. So that, there's always been this distinction, or at least for the past few decades, between espionage that all governments conduct. And this is, a good example of it, the OPM hack. Cyber espionage is challenging that a little bit, where at some point it gets to the point where you need to somehow strike back, or what is acceptable, and when is this just a business as usual, and when does this turn into something else? But the US has tried to argue that economic espionage is a distinctive in that it can be prosecuted. And so that's why many of these industrial espionage cases have found their way into court in the United States.
I mean, I would have thought that the commercial stealing seeds is commercial is a what should we say? It's a civil case rather than a criminal foreign one. Trying to raid some of these patents, look at some of these trademarks. They are civil cases. They're not for the full panoply of the state to come. But obviously, we're looking at it differently. The Chinese look at it differently as well, of course.
So decades ago, it would have been. So the Economic Espionage Act only dates to the 1990s. And, until then, these cases were handled primarily through civil lawsuits. One of the people pardoned yesterday was Anthony Lewandowski, who's a former Google engineer who was convicted of stealing trade secrets. Trump pardoned him at the last minute, but this is precisely the sort of thing that many Chinese scientists are convicted of doing. And, I cynically think that if Lewandowski had been ethnic Chinese, that Pompeo and others would have splashed his name across, it would have called him a traitor and all of this. But there is a bit of a double standard.
Well, most countries have double standards. It's just we should have the maturity to stand back and acknowledge it when we're looking at these cases. But the other part is the misinformation, which you've seen and been tracking. We see that Twitter cancelled the Chinese embassy account for that rather clumsy and primitive tweet from the Chinese embassy about how ravishingly happy the Uyghur women were with the new regime that gave them feminine womanhood and
they're not just baby producing machines anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, but what struck me is the Chinese are more sophisticated. That was a really primitive, counterproductive tweet in Western terms. You might get away with it in China or Enver Hoxha's Albania, but tweeting how happy the Uyghur womanhood are with the wise guidance of the CPC doesn't carry much weight outside of China. Why would they do something that stupid?
I can't explain that tweet. The thing about the disinformation landscape that is so alarming right now is that you have disinformation coming from the Chinese government, as it has for years. You also have disinformation coming from GTV, which is this network that Steve Bannon started with Guo Wengui, who's a exiled Chinese billionaire. And you have at the same time the Epoch Times, which was, originally a Falun Gong publication and has always kind of presented itself in opposition to the Chinese government, but is lately really flirted with a lot of conspiracy theories. It's also been very pro-Trump, but it has played a big role in pushing disinformation and pushing COVID denialism. And so you have all of these players in this ecosystem, and we see them increasingly interacting with other, QAnon and these other destabilizing forces. So I did one story for the Intercept last fall where I looked at this dossier on Hunter Biden that came out of Asia. It came out of Asia in September, even before the New York Post story came out, the series on Hunter Biden's laptop. This was another report that had a very murky origin. So
can you walk us through the steps there as you see them from your reporting? Because it's got to the point, most people don't see the story, but you mentioned Hunter Biden, and even Biden's supporters will think, well, maybe they were up to something, or this is something to be hidden. Is there something to be hidden there? Where did it come from, and how did it gain traction?
Well, right. So the issue of Hunter Biden's activities in China is, I think, an interesting one, and one that deserves scrutiny. But this particular report was interesting because it had been authored by a fake consultancy and a fake author. So somebody had gone to elaborate lengths to kind of create this consultancy in Switzerland, I believe, and then create the fake author of the report. And so after a researcher in Australia uncovered this, it turned out that one of the actual authors of the report was a man that many China journalists know from Twitter. We've interacted with him for years, a guy named Chris Balding, who is based in Vietnam. And then my report focused on how he had worked with another person in Florida who also had a concocted identity and had who basically was not who he said he was. And then at the same time, there was also the publisher of Apple Daily in Hong Kong. His assistant, who is somebody who's very close to the Trump administration, had played a role in the report. So all of this had come out of Asia, and that is a story that I think it still hasn't seen its conclusion. It would be interesting to see where it goes. But I also get the sense that this is one of many such stories that we will see in years to come. QAnon is not going away. Disinformation is not going away. The Epoch Times has a lot of funding from somewhere. And so it will be interesting to see how that plays out in the Biden administration.
From what you can see, there's no real there. It was completely fabricated in the Hunter Biden case.
Well, somebody had gone to lengths to fabricate the author and the fake institute behind the report. Some of the claims in it may have checked out, but it was a kind of classic mix of truth and falsehood. And then that coupled with these fake identities. I'm sorry?
I don't think that Hunter Biden was doing his father any favors by accepting dubious money and sinecures from Ukrainians, Russians, and Chinese across the
No. Wait, and then what was
anything else, whether it was ethical or not, it did his father no favors at all.
No, certainly not. And then, what was interesting about this is that in addition to just concocting this fake institute, the fake author, someone had also made fake avatars where using one of these pieces of software where you blend all these images together. And so this is something so far.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I'm very worried about what we will see in the years ahead in the disinformation sphere. Obviously Russia's very good at it. China had some of its efforts seem a little haphazard. Some of their Twitter bots have been exposed, and you wonder like why they spent so much effort on these people with these very obviously fake profiles. But I imagine it's just getting so much more accessible, so much easier to put out this kind of information and generate fake people, fake identities, that I imagine we'll see more of that.
I suppose we should welcome the democratization of fabrication and lies, but I don't really. I mean, the question is, is there anything we can do about it? I mean, because the Hunter Biden story was passed on by a lot of people who should have known better. We know the proprietors who are involved, the Post, and there was a whole kind of panoply of people, Brown, Bannon, and the others who were happy to ventilate this story.
Giuliani and others, yes.
Yes, naming other crooks. And, this has happened before where you can attack people through their children. I remember Kofi Annan on the oil for food. A lot of the accusations were because his son was trying his hand in Ghana, who he wasn't very close to at all. But all you needed was the coincidence of the names to attack a public figure, which is why children should remember their parents' reputations as well as their own, I suppose. But what about fact-checking? What about, why were people, so-called respectable media, prepared to carry stories like this without doing elementary fact-checking? Because there comes a point where it becomes how should we say, it's a circular, incestuous fact-checking. We can say it because so-and-so said it.
It's an echo chamber.
Such and such, so it must be true. So we can repeat it. And once you've actually got the engine started, it's very difficult to see where to stop, short of assassination or massive libel suits. It's very difficult to see how you can stop that machine once it started rolling.
Yeah, and just to kind of tie this all together, I think this issue of people having ties or financial interests in China or in other countries is only going to continue. This is something that came up in the Trump administration. My colleague and I did a big investigation on the son of the US ambassador to China, Terry Branstad, and his son, Eric Branstad, who also was an official in the Commerce Department, was apparently doing lobbying work in China that the timeline looks suspicious. So this will also be an issue for other officials in the Biden administration. The issue of Hunter Biden aside, there are people who he's appointed who have strategic consultancies in Asia. So, there's been a lot of scrutiny on this issue of Chinese influence overseas. And a lot of that falls on ethnic Chinese and falls on the researchers and the scholars that we've talked about. And, often those people are the first to get thrown under the bus. But when you look deeper at, people in government and where have these people been traveling, who have they been meeting with, and, what kind of financial interests do they have? You find that this is a problem that reaches to many people who you wouldn't suspect. And so, I think that will continue to be an issue under the Biden administration as well.
I'm thinking recently, for example, there was the Chinese tourist who I think she's waiting sentencing, isn't she? The one who wandered into Mar-a-Lago with a set of phones. Can you conceive any reasonable, acceptable reason why she was doing what she was doing?
I did not look into that case in detail. I know the one that you're talking about, but Trump gained a reputation for being very tough on China, and I think that's probably unfair. He was unfairly favoring him, right?
You're the only
Because
person in America, on the East Coast probably, who thinks that he's been treated unfairly. But yes, go on.
unfair in the sense that it's too nice to him, right? Because
Yes, okay.
His approach on China was highly schizophrenic, and he did things like come out with these bans on TikTok and WeChat that were then not followed through on. On the other hand, the administration backpedaled on putting sanctions on Xinjiang, and because he wanted to reach a deal in the trade war. And so these competing interests were very much at play in the administration. Now, at least some of that noise will be gone. And I mean the noise of just, here's a declaration on TikTok, here's a declaration on WeChat. But the underlying issue of an administration both having interests overseas and people who have worked overseas and people who are maybe still making their money in other countries. And I'm not talking about Hunter Biden here. I'm talking about people in the administration. That will not go away.
No. In our remaining time, tell us what you think ought to happen in U.S.-Chinese relations during the Biden presidency. Do you think that they should ratchet up more systematic pressure across the board, or should they go for what the Chinese are calling a reset, a return to the Obama era of relative, I would call it naivete? How do you see it, the big picture?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, my job is just to observe, and I don't want to be I would not want to be in charge of China policy right now. I think it's a very difficult moment. I do think you can undo some of the unnecessary tension that has been ratcheted up over the past year. Some of the rhetoric calling COVID the China flu, the Wuhan flu, like those are obvious wins. But on the other hand, China has just pushed through horrible policies in Hong Kong in the past year. The issue of the camps in Xinjiang is only becoming more of a concern. There are a number of ways in which,
and notably, the
U.S.
administration actually backpedaled on those. It did not seem desperately concerned about the repression in Hong Kong or in Xinjiang for a long time. They waited until the dying days of the administration,
right, and just finally declared. Yeah, so I mean those, and yeah, I worry about the relationship, as many people do, and in reporting my book, I talked to scholars of the Cold War period, because the book is set in the present day, and it focuses on this one story that played out in this cornfield and in the Midwest, mostly in the past few years. I did want to understand the history of the relationship when it came to this dispute over science and over technology. And it always stays with me that this one Cold War historian who studied the US-China relationship told me that there is this mirroring phenomenon that happens during a period of tension. And I've seen that go on with the United States and China. And
can you define mirroring? Explain what you mean by that.
Meaning where the two sides start to behave similarly, but in this kind of escalating way.
You've met the enemy and he's us.
Well, if we treat China like the enemy, they will become the enemy. That's the mirroring concept.
What on a broader scale, I mean, the big thing that China has done, which I think a lot of Americans don't realize, one of the differences with the Cold War, by the way, strikes me, is we weren't sitting down watching Soviet-made televisions or wearing Soviet shoes or wearing Soviet shirts at the time. There's a huge difference in the relationships between the two. But the Belt and Road Initiative is one that it has been explored. Have you done any explorations in it? Is this a concerted power grab by the Chinese, an attempt to rip off the third world with massive debt? Or, as some third worlders will tell you, is this a generous and selfless mutual exchange that is helping develop Africa and the third world when the West refuses to put up the capital to do so?
So I haven't done substantive reporting on the Belt and Road Initiative, so I don't feel qualified to talk about it.
Okay. Can you get your data mining machines and check for us, please? It's something of interest to us all.
I don't want to give my armchair opinion on something I haven't done a fair amount of research
You'll
on.
never get a job in the Trump.
If you want to ask me about the solar panels or the pandas,
She'll never go anywhere in this business, Ian, if she's not willing to shoot her mouth off from the armchair.
Yeah. Fox is not going to employ you no matter what you say. So I think we are coming towards the end, but we really, I mean, we're talking about reporting here. Is there anything that we can do to, we have a problem here now, because speaking of the mirror imaging, the last administration introduced the beginning of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. So foreign news agencies were required to register as foreign agents, and they introduced restrictions on visas for foreign correspondents, which mirrored, I have to say, what the Chinese were doing for the Wall Street Journal and Western and New York Times and Western journalists in China. Do you have some thoughts on this? Are they each sort of escalating and using each other to ramp up this war on information?
Yeah, you know, I remember being a journalist in China and having visa troubles, as many people did, and whereas, you know, wait months for your visa to be renewed, and you wonder at the last minute, will it be renewed? You know, I once waited, I think, for a year overseas to get a visa, and that was not uncommon. And I remember at that time, many journalists feeling like, oh, why won't the US government take up our cause? And so I had mixed feelings when the Trump administration did do that, but it so quickly escalated. And, you know, I know has put many Chinese journalists not working for Xinhua and so forth, just for actual news agencies in difficult situations. So yeah, I have mixed feelings about that, and also that was done at last February against the backdrop of all these other escalating tensions and finger pointing over COVID. It was also that same month a big FBI DOJ press conference on this China initiative and on many trade secrets theft cases, and the rhetoric there was also being ratcheted up. So I think all of that, it's hard to kind of divorce this issue of the visas from everything else in the relationship.
I think the idea on both sides, there are no binary solutions. Yes, the Chinese are stealing. Yes, the Americans are overreacting. The thing this calls for is a bit of nuance, and that's completely missing from both sides' dialogue at the moment. It remains to be seen whether the new administration can introduce that magical element of nuance into the relationship and the standing firm against Chinese depredations without provoking and giving excuses for them. It's something we've been pushing for. We protested both about the Chinese, about the restrictions on Xinhua and the restrictions on the Washington Times, and not the Washington Times.
Sounds like, Ian, you should be the next American ambassador to China. If you understand it that well, you should be our ambassador.
Nuance, yes. Well, I've got my picture with Zhou Enlai. I'll send it to them. Might get credentials. Yeah. My experience drinking Mao Tai with Zhou Enlai should surely qualify me. But I don't think I've got the clout with the Biden administration to get that position yet. You're better. You speak Mandarin. I don't. So I think we're coming towards the end now. I'd like to thank Mara Hvistendahl from the Intercept. It's done excellent reporting of the kind that's disappearing from the so-called mainstream media. And it's difficult. It is true as a concept, but it's difficult to say it without sounding like you're pandering to QAnon and the other people, because they picked up the rhetoric. And to Bill Holstein, a veteran China reporter, former president of the Overseas Press Club, and also author of books about Chinese industrial espionage and other espionage in the US. Your book's name, Bill?
It's called The New Art of War, China's Deep Strategy Inside the United States.
There we are, a public service announcement from Bill.
Yes, I appreciate it.
But thank you, everybody. Next week, in fact, we're on a related theme where we have the Damien from Oregon, the professor of journalism, who has just authored a report for the Reuters Thompson Fellowship about the effect of COVID on reporting in the rest of the world, which ties into what we're doing, because no government seems to want the truth. The first casualty of this particular virus has been the truth everywhere, as governments, Western and others, try to distort the facts, hide the facts, and present the version that they want. You know, I look at Britain, I look here, and numbers are, let's see, they are constant reflux. How many people died? Well, depends on who you're asking and what they're connected to. But thank you very much. We hope to see you soon. This is the Foreign Press Association in New York. Hoping to see you soon at our other webinars. That one is coming up. We have another one on Monsanto coming up soon as well. So we have lots of, there's always a scandal for us to look at and to find reporters who have bravely tried to cover the scandal. Thank you, Mara.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.